Hey, what's up everybody? I'm back. And in this video, it's gonna be a special video because it's all about the Super Nintendo Entertainment System by Nintendo. And it's the 25th anniversary of when the Super Nintendo was released back in 1991. And I was 11 years old when I first played the Super Nintendo. And like many other people have said, the Super Nintendo is my all-time favorite gaming console that there is. Nintendo, whatever, other companies, it is my favorite console of all time because of what it did for the gaming industry at the time. It really put its stamp in all ways on the gaming industry during that time when it was on the market. Basically selling the most that it could was between 1991 and 1996 before the Nintendo 64 came out. The Super Nintendo was revolutionary. It was absolutely incredible and ahead of its time in many ways. The technical aspects of it were unmatched for a 16-bit console. And I really remember it being a real focus to have 3D effects be a mainstay on the Super Nintendo. And they started it right away at launch with games like Pilot Wings, F-Zero, Super Mario World. And just about all the games at launch were using that Mode 7 effect where it had the rotation and scaling of objects on the screen. And at that time, that was revolutionary because no one did perspective changes like that on the screen. So right out of the gate, the Super Nintendo had an advantage over the Sega Genesis because no Sega Genesis games were doing that type of effect. Some games would cheat that effect a little bit, but it would never look as good as Super Nintendo. That's why Mode 7, the term, actually became something that was synonymous with the Super Nintendo's graphical capabilities because it was a real capability. It wasn't like blast processing where it was just because the CPU was a little faster and the Genesis didn't have as much slowdown in game, which plagued the Super Nintendo in its early days, but was fixed later in its life with higher memory bandwidth cartridges. So it really became a non-issue. So the Super Nintendo was an incredible machine and innovation in many ways in gameplay and of course in the cartridges themselves. The Super FX chip was revolutionary at the time. In 1993 they released Star Fox, which was a huge game which made 3D polygonal graphics possible on a 16-bit machine with no attachment or no additional hardware needed because all the technology was built inside the cartridge. So this was a great breakthrough that was used in some other games as well, like Stunt Race FX and Doom, for example. Used the Super FX chip to have that 3D scaling and 3D rendering of actual polygonal objects on the screen. And this was unheard of at the time. Like when I first saw that game, Star Fox in '93, I was totally blown away. And I still remember that commercial to this day back in '93 advertising that game. It just looked way ahead of its time. Of course, it looks like nothing now, but during that time, it was something that was really revolutionary, and it brought the Super Nintendo up to a level that nobody was expecting. And then with innovations in rendering techniques with Rare and their Donkey Kong Country games, we saw fully 3D rendered models in side-scrolling games like Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3, Killer Instinct, for example, and some other games were using the technique as well. So the way the games looked were a step above the Sega Genesis in every way, and it really pushed the Super Nintendo into another realm of where a 16-bit console should be considered, because Nintendo really tried their best to innovate with the graphics and to keep it competitive even without upgrading the hardware. Then of course the Super Nintendo was really remembered by everybody because of its games. The games were absolutely incredible, and Nintendo had of course the best games there were on the market, but also the third-party games were some of the best that we've ever seen as well. You know, games like Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, all those games were extremely good on the Super Nintendo and better than their Sega Genesis counterparts for the cross-platform type of games. And while the Super Nintendo didn't have as many sports games as the Genesis did, it still had its Maddens and still had its hockey games and it had its baseball games. It still had a gigantic breadth of different genres on the Super Nintendo. So basically the Super Nintendo wasn't lacking in anything. It had absolutely everything. It was the perfect console. There's nothing wrong with that console at all. I still to this day can't find anything wrong with that console. It had absolutely everything going for it, and it's my all-time favorite console, like I said. So I'm going to list my 10 favorite Super Nintendo games as of right now, because it kind of changes every now and then, because the Super Nintendo has so many great games, hundreds of great games. There are so many great games on that system, it's impossible to have an all-time 10 best Super Nintendo games. It's really impossible, because it really depends on the mood of the person, right? So depending on my mood, this is basically what my top 10 is right now. At number 10, Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting. Number 9, Star Fox. Number 8, Castlevania 4. Number 7, F-Zero. Number 6, The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Number 5, Final Fantasy VI, also known as Final Fantasy III in the United States. Number 4, Super Mario RPG. Number 3, Donkey Kong Country 2: Diddy's Kong Quest. Number 2, and number 1, well, number 2 and number 1, they're a toss-up for me, because they're both incredible, fantastic games and completely different games. You can probably imagine what I'm going to say, but number 2, I'm going to have to give it to Chrono Trigger, and number 1, Super Metroid. So it's a toss-up between those two, because Chrono Trigger is an absolutely amazing game, the best RPG there is on a Nintendo platform and of all time, in my opinion. And Super Metroid is the best platformer side-scrolling adventure game there is of all time. So it's kind of hard to have a 1-2 there, and it's almost like a tie basically for number 1 there. So fantastic, fantastic games. You can't go wrong with the Super Nintendo. If you could pick one up for yourself, I highly suggest you do so, and get a TV that has SCART capabilities without having that terrible composite connection that everyone knows looks really bad for Super Nintendo and those old 16-bit games. Get a SCART connection and get some kind of upscaling res converter that would help you enjoy these games in their original state. Because whenever you emulate Super Nintendo games, or even on the Virtual Console, it's never going to be exactly the same experience no matter what you do. So I highly suggest you play it on the original hardware, and you will not be disappointed, trust me. Congratulations to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, 25 years of being the best console there is of all time. I love that console. Let me know what you guys think. Is it your favorite console? Or what is your favorite console if it's not the Super Nintendo? Let me know what you think in the comment section. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe, and comment, and I'll talk to you guys very soon in the next video. Take care.